Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Conversations with Therapists. Today I'm joined by Luc Boudreau of Clutch Psychotherapy. Welcome, Luc. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
So, Luc, many people have heard of EMDR, but can you explain in simple terms what it is and how it helps heal people?
EMDR is an evidence-based approach which helps with trauma. It was first developed and researched with PTSD, but now we know that it works beyond, PTSD, including, clients with attachment trauma, clients with adverse childhood experiences, like living with a parent with mental illness or a child that lived in poverty or a child who was bullied. That can be really effective in helping that person deal with, any negative kind of experiences that they have now. So essentially, this theory, because that's what it is, it considers the system as it's called the AIP system, the Adaptive Information Processing System. And it believes that the brain has this natural ability to heal itself. And so when we go through a difficult life experience, our brain, most of the time, can process it and link it to other adaptive memory networks. But sometimes when we face something that's overwhelming, that information can get stuck. And when it gets stuck, it typically tends to encode the same emotion and the same negative belief that we've had at the time. So if you were a 10-year-old girl who, was involved in a car crash and didn't feel safe, and this experience was overwhelming for that little girl, they might still have these feelings of I am not safe. So EMDR helps to allow this client to revisit this memory, and what it does, it's a combination of focused attention with bilateral stimulation. And we believe that the bilateral stimulation is a way to help the brain communicate and reprocess this experience. I'm completely fascinated with EMDR. It is a technique that tends to have pretty fast results. Again, depending on the degree of traumatization. I see a lot of clients with trauma, but clients with like a single event trauma or a very distinct problem, these tend to be fairly quick relative to other modalities. But clients with very complicated or complex trauma histories, it is still very effective, but it can be a little bit longer.
Sort of building off of what you spoke about with the example of the 10-year-old and maybe the car accident, in your experience, how can seemingly minor childhood experiences shape our self-esteem, our confidence, or our sense of self-worth as adults?
I'm glad you asked that, because that is my focus, or the focus of my practice. And in short, the reason for that, again, is because when we're young, those are the formative years of our lives where the brain is developing. And so if a child is raised, again, with a parent who is very dismissive or insulting or shaming, well, that child might learn that they are not good enough, or not, bad, or not safe, etc. And so even when a client is not faced with like a big like PTSD type event, these adverse childhood experiences can be very damaging to one's self-esteem, self-worth, self-confidence. And so I have a lot of clients who are very successful in their field, like CEOs, doctors, lawyers, and yet they still struggle with this feeling of like imposter syndrome, or like I'm not good enough, etc. So they might appear really confident and successful, on the outside, but a lot of people struggle with this like negative voice, right? That always keeps kind of chirping in the background. And I always say, it doesn't have to be that way, right? If you have the intention and the time, there's always EMDR as a really good strategy to kind of help you move forward.
You were saying with, for instance, CEOs that you work with and they still have negative self-talk. My next question, which is a little bit off script, is what other methods that maybe you've been trained in, like how do you compare other methods, maybe CBT, DBT to EMDR? Because you mentioned earlier that you're very passionate about it. It's the
Mhm.
main technique that you use. How in practice do you see the difference with your clients who come to you and do an EMDR and heal that way versus with maybe with other therapists, or in the past they've tried other methods?
Well, first, EMDR is not for everyone. I think there are certain criteria that needs to be met. For example, someone with a lack of self-awareness or someone who struggles with self-regulation, it might not be the best strategy at first. With that said, EMDR is 8 phases. And so phase 1 and 2, is where we do a lot of the preparation work, intake assessment, and phase 2 is what we call the resourcing phase. So essentially, can we get the client ready to start with the trauma reprocessing? You mentioned about other theories, other theoretical interventions, and so the beautiful thing is EMDR works well with other theoretical interventions to help make it more effective. So, for example, I incorporate a lot of internal family systems. I also incorporate a lot of attachment trauma or attachment theory with EMDR because every client is very different, right? And their life experience is going to dictate kind of what strategy might be most effective for each client. And so, again, CBT or cognitive behavioral therapy, it's very effective on its own, but it's also very effective when combined with an approach like EMDR. And so part of the process is kind of collaboratively deciding with the client, how we can best address their issue. That's why it's really important for a therapist to have, a large bag of tricks, a lot of different strategies to kind of help best tailor the treatment plan for each client. That's the fun part, for me, is the case conceptualization and trying to figure out, given these are the client's goals, how can I help them get to that place in the most collaborative way? So I think for me, the main other interventions would be IFS, which I love. It's a very empowering way to help clients. And it's also becoming very much kind of a model for how one can continue to manage with whatever issues comes up later in their life. It really depends on each client.
I had never heard of sort of combining two methods together, but I guess it makes sense. You can kind of take the good from multiple modalities and use it and tailor it, like you said, to the specific client. I wanted to ask, what are EMDR intensives and how do they differ from regular weekly therapy sessions?
So this is something that has become more available today because we have learned through research that EMDR intensives, which essentially is more condensed and focused way of delivering EMDR. So instead of doing, 50 minutes a week for months, right? It's condensing 6 hours a day for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 days, depending on the degree of trauma, on the complexity of the problem. But generally, most ER, at least for me, I don't want to speak for every therapist out there, but generally for me, my EMDR intensives typically consist of 3 hours in the morning, 1 hour break, and then 3 hours in the afternoon, and typically from 1 to 3 days. What happens is it allows for more focus, right? Because when we do weekly sessions, if you think about it, right, you arrive in therapy and generally 5, 10, 15 minutes is spent on hello, how was your week? How's it going? And then the last 10, 15 minutes is typically spent on grounding, right? Making sure the client is okay to leave the office. So what does that leave us? It leaves us with what, 20 to 30 minutes to do EMDR. Versus if we can do an intensive, we have more time together to really get to what is more life changing, right? More effective in processing trauma or adverse childhood experiences. And one analogy that I often use with clients is the car analogy, right? So if you have four bald tires or four tires that are flat, right? You can either go to the mechanic and change one tire a week, or you can go to the mechanic and have all four tires changed at once. And so you get the results a lot faster. There's so many reasons why it can be beneficial, but there's also a lot of reasons why it might not be good for everyone, right? For EMDR intensive, it's really important for the client to have really good coping strategies, for the client to have a safe space, right? Safe and supportive space to go to after therapy, and it's also really good for clients who need like quick results, right? Let's say there's a client who is in a dire situation in a relationship or a client who is really struggling at work and is potentially facing, being let go or something like that. EMDR intensives can be really beneficial for those kind of clients, and it's not beneficial for clients who are unstable or suicidal or who lack the proper resources. So there's an intake, right, that gets to kind of determine that. And again, not everyone is a good client for intensives, but together we get to kind of decide if it is. And if not, it doesn't mean that it's never going to be a possibility, but what that might mean is maybe there's some preparation work that needs to be done before those intensives are done. The beautiful thing with therapy now is we can do them remotely. We can also do them in person. And so this is something else that's been really incredible since COVID happened. We've learned a lot about what treatment interventions are most effective. And, because for a long time we thought that, only therapy in person was the most intensive, but now we've kind of realized that generally we can get the same effects, whether it's remote or in person. Personally, I love in-person therapy because I think there's a big part which, it's about establishing trust and connection. But I also work a lot with clients in various parts of the States. It's a pretty cool thing, and I really, really enjoy it because you get to focus on this one issue and you get to be laser focused, right? Because when I see client after client after client, it's a lot, not only harder for me to kind of really zoom in on what the client wants to work on, but I think it's also beneficial for the client because they get to really put everything else aside for that day or two or three and to really dedicate their time to getting profound change.
Something that you mentioned just now was that you actually have the option to do EMDR virtually, which I didn't know was possible. For some reason in my head, I thought EMDR was a strictly in-person thing because of something with the eye movements and just being more face-to-face. How would something like EMDR work virtually, or is it not that different? There's just a screen in between. How does that happen?
Right. So now we have so many programs and options for bilateral stimulation. The one that most people think about when we think of EMDR is, follow my fingers, and that is often good in person. But we can also do bilateral eye stimulation via Zoom with some external programs. We send a link to the client. The client opens the link, and then they're guided to this dot on their screen, and they just follow the dot on their screen. And on my end, I get to control, the speed of the dot, the direction of the dot, the color of the dot. I get to really monitor, how many passes happens, all this stuff. But essentially, the client is simply told to pay attention to what's on the screen. So that is one option. We can also use a sound. So we can send them an audio file and which kind of provides them with this bilateral sound, which engages the client in a different way. There's also ways to engage the client via tapping, which it could be like this tapping, or it could be tapping on their knees or whatnot. But there's a lot of different strategies. And again, that's something that we kind of decide together as to what feels best for the client. For example, if a client comes to me with an eye infection, well, I won't use the eyes to do the bilateral stimulation. or if a client has hearing issues or et cetera. So it really is something that we get to decide together.
Lastly, what misconceptions do people often have about EMDR or EMDR intensives? And what would you like listeners to understand?
Well, EMDR works best when you have a defined issue, right? Because if a client comes and says, "Well, I just want to be happy," it's not really enough, right? We need to have a more targeted approach. And the other thing too is a lot of clients think that they're going to be cured, after the hour or within a week or two. EMDR is a process. Like I said earlier, EMDR is 8 phases, and some clients go through the process faster than others for various reasons. Again, it could be a matter of coping skills. It could be a matter of trauma history, complex presentations. Again, if a client, severe dissociative tendencies, or is not stable, there's a lot more that needs to kind of happen. And so, yeah, so that's kind of maybe the main thing I would say is to just be open-minded to the process and not going in with this predetermined kind of expectation that I'm going to be healed, in an hour or in a week or two, right? It's still something that requires, preparation, it requires the work, and it requires, follow up, right? For some people more than others. And so that's what I would kind of tell them.
Well, thank you so much for being here today and sharing such valuable insight. I know I learned a lot about EMDR and the process and all the different complexities and iterations of it. And I feel like we only scratched the surface, but I'm excited to learn more. And so thank you for sharing.
Yeah, you're welcome. Yeah, and thanks for having me on. It was really fun.